Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, great. That's the kind of response we want. We are so delighted that each and every one of you is here today just to have this time to learn and talk and engage. And so this is a really special time. And we welcome you to our Power of Diversity lecture. This is the last one for this academic year. Our diversity program manager, Tiara Sargent over there, will be planning and working on what's coming up in the next year. So hopefully we'll be able to have some exciting announcements for our next academic year. The Office for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity sponsors this lecture series with the purpose to inspire campus dialogue, community engagement, and civic education and learning about the national narrative on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that everyone will agree that it is ever present in the national narrative today. And unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation out there that we need to be active advocates and engage in this discussion. Now, if you missed any of the past lectures or would like to learn more about future events sponsored by OIDIO, I encourage you to visit our webpage and you can learn more about this series and other matters that we have to offer. So as you know, today we are featuring Kwame Christian. He is the founder and CEO of American Negotiation Institute and the host of the world's most popular negotiation podcast, Negotiate Anything, which has over 8 million downloads and listeners and in more than 180 countries. Christian's career took off after his popular TED Talk, Finding Confidence in Conflict. Now, this led him to write 2 best-selling books, Finding Confidence in Conflict, and the subject of today, How to Have Difficult Conversations About Race. Under Kwame's leadership, A&I has coached and trained several Fortune 500 companies on applying the fundamentals of negotiation to corporate success. Kwame was the recipient of the John Glenn College of Public Affairs Young Alumni Achievement Award in 2020, the Ohio State University Moritz College of Law Outstanding Recent Alumni Award in 2021, and the 2022 Columbus 40 Under 40 Award. His proudest achievement, however, is his family. He's married to Dr. Whitney Christian, who's a physician, and they have 2 lovely sons, Kai and Dominic. Now, Christian also is ranked in the 99th percentile of chess.com, which has over 20 million active players, led the Ohio State University's tennis club team to the national tournament, and according to him, has the best dad jokes. Right? I added that according to him. This is really a special moment for me. Kwame and I go back a long, long way. I'm immensely encouraged and proud of the work that he's done. And I'll date myself, but I remember first meeting Kwame when he was an undergraduate student interested in going to law school. So that was a long time ago. And certainly he has done many outstanding things. So before Kwame comes before us, I want to remind everyone that at the conclusion of his remarks, we will have a Q&A period. And I think that he wants to put more emphasis on Q&A, so get your questions ready and your thoughts to share. And that's questions and engagements, not speeches. Dr. Burton and I just returned from a national conference, and we found some people who wanted to make speeches and not ask questions. So we want questions. We will also have books available at the back of the room where he can sign. Those of you who have the books, we've distributed some, but there are additional books, and he will be signing all of them. And there's a special surprise about the books, right? I'll let him tell you, the ones that are back there. So without further ado, let's welcome Kwame Christian.
All right. Testing. You got me? Yeah. Perfect. All right. Thank you. One thing that was left out of the bio was that my wife was born in Cleveland. Yes, yes, yes. She grew up in Akron, and now we met at OSU. So let's jump into this, because like Dean Solomon said, I like to get to the questions. All right, so this is going to be our little approach here. I'm going to keep my remarks really, really short, because I like to engage with all of you. Not surprisingly, I mean, you read the book. I like more conversations here, okay? So as I present, I'm going to ask questions. These questions are not rhetorical. We're going to start participating early. Sound good? All right, cool. So this is our motto at the American Negotiation Institute. Push it higher. Okay. How am I now? We're good? Am I going to be tied to the microphone here? Oh man. Okay.
You can use that.
I can use it.
Just need to
I'll just hold it. I'll just hold it. Yeah, I'll just hold it.
closer and think that you're in a courtroom.
Okay. So think that I'm in a courtroom, yell and be angry. Okay, how's this? Is this better? All right, Mike. Thank you. Let's do this. Thank you. Testing, testing. Is this better? Cool. Yeah, I never like using these things. They're so heavy. It's hard for me to hold it up. All right, cool. So this is our motto. We believe the best things in life are on the other side of difficult conversations. So if you look back over the course of your lifetime, in any type of situation, most likely if you look at the most impactful moments of your life, there's going to be a difficult conversation somewhere in the vicinity of that moment. So as you listen to this presentation and we talk about how to have these difficult conversations, I want to remind you how important this is, yes, for us as advocates and allies, but also just over the course of our life. I want these skills that we learn to be broadly applicable in all of your conversations, all right? So I want you to start thinking about all of the difficult conversations that come up for you as an opportunity. There's always an opportunity. So how many of you have seen the potential of a difficult conversation and then you got scared and decided not to have that conversation? There we go. Be proud. So we have about 90% of the audience and then 10% are liars. Okay, cool. I see you. That's fine. So here's a simple mindset shift you can change in order to lean more into those conversations. Because when we're triggered by fear, it's because we see some kind of risk. Usually when we have the prospect of a difficult conversation, we could see all of the potential bad things that could happen, right? It's a focus thing. But what we need to think about it is we have to recognize that there are positive things that we can lean into. So if any kind of conversation, let's focus on race first, but just any kind of conversation, what is the opportunity? So try to finish this sentence. This conversation is an opportunity to what? Grow, learn. What else? Teach, understand, change, improve. Right. So if you find yourself in a situation where you are hesitant to engage in the conversation, just challenge yourself. This conversation is an opportunity to what? You can always finish that sentence. And then you'll probably start to recognize that there are risks to not having the conversations. All right? So the mindset is really important. So when we think about our approach at the American Negotiation Institute for difficult conversations, we think about it through these three lenses: mindset, skill set, culture, right? So when you think about the mindset, why is mindset so important? Not rhetorical. Just raise your hand, I'll call you. Yeah. Opportunity, good. What else? Yeah. Yes, self-awareness and awareness of others, good. You have to be intentional before you use your skills. Yes, because what happens if you're not intentional? Yeah, we know. Exactly, right? So we have to have the right mindset. So a lot of times I recognize that we're giving skills to people who are afraid to get in the kitchen, right? So we're giving recipes to people who are afraid to get in the kitchen. So if you are having trouble in these conversations, a lot of times we try to find different strategies, different tactics. What should I say? What's a better argument? But if you're afraid, fundamentally afraid, either you're going to not have the conversation at all, or you're going to have the conversation and you're going to either pull back or be too aggressive. Something's going to go wrong. So the mindset is important. So we have to have confidence. But then we also have to recognize that there's a very big difference between being assertive and being aggressive in a conversation too. What do you think that difference is? Yeah. There you go. Bingo. So when you're aggressive, you already have your outcome in mind. You already know the complete truth, and you're just trying to get your point across. And all they need to do is kind of be a willing vessel for your brilliance. Right? That's it. So with assertiveness, we recognize that our voice has value, that there's a purpose behind what we're saying, and we have a right to say what's on our mind. Right? That's fair. While at the same time recognizing that the other person has the same right. That's assertiveness. Aggression is just focusing on your own agenda and not giving other people a chance. How many people agree with that? How many people struggle with it in the moment? Exactly, right? And that's the thing, because a lot of times we just say these truisms, but we don't acknowledge how emotionally challenging it is to put it into practice. So one of the things I said, and I think I mentioned this in the book, but my favorite Da Vinci quote is, "Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication." So I worked really hard to simplify all of these concepts. So the things that I say, you're not going to struggle to understand them, but you will struggle to put it into practice because it's really hard to do. Okay? So mindset is really important. Then we have to have skill set too, okay? So how many of you have ever had a negotiation or conflict resolution kind of class? Ever? Ever. So we have about 30%. How many times did you take that class? How many people have taken 5 classes? 4, 3, 2, 1. Peeps, come on now. How many of you are having difficult conversations? Okay. So think about this. So we can all think about times where we've struggled in difficult conversations, and we wonder why. Potentially, it's because we haven't been trained, right? And so I wanted this to be a skills-based book, so you could actually know what to do and what to say in the moment. And somebody I was talking to earlier said they liked the examples in the book. And I always kind of cringe when somebody says that they like the examples, because examples have become like a trigger word in my mind, because I thought I was done with this book like 7 different times. So I give it to the publisher, and they're like, you know what, it's good, but we need a few more examples. I'm like, oh my God! So I'm always a little bit, I don't know how I feel about it, but I guess they were right. So I'm glad you like the examples. But I want that to be practical, so you could actually see what a conversation looks like, right? Then we have culture. Why is culture important? Yeah. Yeah. Bingo. Exactly. We have to understand the culture to understand how we approach the conversation. Different cultures require different approaches, right? So think about driving. We don't just drive the same way every day. Some days it's snowy. You know, again, this is coming close to my heart, because you remember, did it randomly snow one day? Okay. Yeah. In March. So I was driving that day and I said, hey, Kwame, let's slow it down. So I was executing the most pathetic right turn, and my car just slid to the side and just bent the tire. I was without a car for a month. So I got it back to make it here, so I'm happy. I'm happy now. But that's what happens. In our conversations, we can crash if we don't pay attention to the conditions, right? We try to pretend like we can approach every single conversation the exact same way, but we don't take the time to consider the cultural elements. And I don't think we have a really good understanding of what culture means. So I have, so with the podcast, one of the things I love about it is that I talk to people who are smarter than me, and they teach me new things. So I think about culture now in terms of big C culture and little c culture. So big C culture, we have nations, we have geographies, those type of things, ethnicities, those type of things, right? But then with little c culture, the definition is the way that we do things. So how many of you work here? Okay. So are there different cultures department to department? Yes. Easy here. No details. But yes, there are differences, right? But if we say, oh, this is the way that we do things, then we're going to make a really fundamental mistake here. Because a lot of times we fail to recognize that the conflicts that we have are cross-cultural problems. They're cross-cultural conflicts. It's not right versus wrong. It's your way and my way. Neither of us is necessarily right, But we have to, through this conversation, create our own little microculture where we can find our way. But we don't take the time to recognize the nuances of culture. And then think about just organizationally too. If you as an individual, if you have the right mindset and you have the right skill set, but the culture isn't tolerant of the conversation, still going to run into problems, right? So when you're thinking about these interactions, we have to think about it holistically, internally within ourselves with the mindset, the skill set that we bring to the actual conversation, and then the culture that's going to play a role in the conversation with the other people, but then just thinking about it from a DEI perspective holistically within organizations. A lot of times we encourage people to have these conversations, but we don't give them the skills to actually have it at a high level. So all of these things are going to have an impact on the way that we have these conversations. All right. Cool. So understanding the why. Why should we still be talking about race in 2023? We elected Obama. Thought we were done. Why should we still be having these conversations? What do you think? It's important, and we never had them, right? Right? It's important. So, fun fact. So if you read the book, chapter 1 gives the answer to this question. Why should we have these conversations? And so I've settled on this word, care. We have these conversations because we care. Now, the fun fact about this is that the publisher, again, when I thought I was done, they said, hey, it feels like we're missing something. It feels like we just jumped right into the strategy and tactics. I was like, yeah, isn't that awesome? That's exactly what I wanted to do. They said we need to lay the foundation. Why should we have these conversations? I said, isn't it obvious? Well, explain it, Kwame. Why? I struggled. I really struggled. I found myself regurgitating DEI talking points. There's a business case for diversity. It's good to be inclusive, those type of things. I didn't think that was strong enough. And then if you've ever had a situation where somebody asks you to explain the obvious, it's kind of hard to do, right? And then it's really simple. We care. So like, what is it that we care about? People. What else? Relationships. The future, right? Progress. We see that there are challenges here. We have to address them. But that starts with conversation. We can't just all move in unity without communicating to each other, right? So a lot of times we think about these difficult conversations as conversations we're going to have with people who see the world differently. That's true. But still with people who are on our same team, other allies and advocates, still going to have these tough conversations with them too. And I think that's something that surprises people when they find themselves in conflict with people who are on the same team, right? But the people we're going to have these difficult conversations with the most are the people who are closest to us. And so we need to make sure that we're bringing those same skills to all of those conversations. Yeah. Oh, it needs to be really close. Okay. Cool. Thank you. Good feedback. All right. Now, when we think about the risk of not having these conversations, what comes to mind? Safety. Yeah, there's going to be a major safety risk, right? Because if we don't have the conversations, the dangers that are still happening will continue to perpetuate, right? We can't protect people if we're unable to talk about what the issues are. Man, I got to be like rapper style here. I'm about to eat this mic. Okay, cool. All right. Okay. Whitney made me promise no singing. All right, cool. So safety, what else? Complacency, yeah. Well, when we think about complacency, that's essentially stagnation. We stay in the same place. You only want to stay in the same place if you're comfortable where you are. And that's a privilege. That's a massive privilege to not have to worry about the problems that are being experienced by people, right? So that's good. What else? What other risks? Yeah, the unaddressed issues just continue to perpetuate. Good. I see 2 hands back there. Yes. If we give approval to the status quo by not addressing things. Well, think about the old American principle of tacit consent. By living here, you are consenting to laws, right? And by seeing bad things happening in our communities, in our organizations, and not saying anything, we're giving tacit consent to what's happening. So yeah, that's good. Ooh, that's one that's not talked about enough. So regression, losing strides that are gained. So we think about, hey, we don't want the status quo to be maintained, but we also think about the fact that if we do not continue to push forward, it's not just that we'll stay in the same place, we might move backwards. We're seeing that in certain places. Yeah, yep. Yes. People's lives are at risk, especially when you think, we have the criminal justice system, we have healthcare. When I was at the Kirwan Institute, that was my main focus, health inequities, right? So lives are at stake. And I think people act like it's hyperbole, but it's not. Yeah, that's good. Let's get one more. Yeah. Yes, lack of connection and breakdown of communities. The way that we stay together is by having conversations. But if we continue to isolate ourselves by putting ourselves in these silos, then our communities start to break down, right? We're seeing more tribalism coming up day after day after day. And so we have to be really intentional about giving ourselves these opportunities to interact with other people who might see the world differently. Right? You have to think about it. Sometimes you might be the only opportunity that somebody has to see the world in a different type of way. And so when I started to think of it that way, I would think about these difficult or frustrating conversations almost like a privilege. Wow, if I don't have this conversation, they may never have an opportunity to talk to somebody who sees the world in the way that I do, who has my experience, right? So that's beneficial for me to help them. But also, as an advocate and an ally, it's beneficial for me to learn from them too. Even if I don't agree, then I have to understand how they think and empathize with them. Understand how they think about the situation, how do they feel about the situation, and generally what is their perspective. Because even if I don't end up persuading this particular person, I can use this information to empathize at a higher level with somebody else who might be more receptive, right? Good. Okay, so when you think about the difficult conversations about race that come up for you day to day, what comes to mind? Yes.
I'll give it a real example, and I'm a little hoarse. I own a home care agency, and I send aid out to homes to take care of seniors. We have to be respectful that if there's anyone who has a hearing disability, they're taking them. Good afternoon. I own a home care agency, and I take care of seniors, and I send them. When families are in need of services, they use my services. And I still run into, until this day, having families say to me they don't want a black aide taking care of their loved one. And so I find myself as an employer trying to give the appropriate answer while obeying the law, and yet still saying to myself, you are looking at me. You have invited me to sit at your kitchen table and have a cup of coffee. And now you're saying to me, you don't want somebody that looks like me to bathe your mother. Now, what am I supposed to do with that?
Wow. I wish we had
Drop
a
the
conflict
mic.
resolution expert up here to come up with an answer. And here's the thing. There is no good answer. I think this is really important to acknowledge in these situations, because sometimes we want to have that silver bullet that we can pull out and use and it works. But that's not the way that human psychology works. We have to figure out what the appropriate answer is for you in that situation. So we have to think about the business concern. You're a business owner, so that will color the response that you give. You have to think about the well-being and psychological safety of your team. They want to know that you're advocating for them. That has to be part of your answer. You also have to think about it from this lens, an opportunity to educate and teach people a better way. That has to be filtered into your answer. And there's all of that swirling in your head, sitting at the table where you're just trying to have a decent day and do your job, right? And so what we have to do when those situations come up, a lot of times that's the thing about these conversations. They're going to come up when we do not expect them. And so these situations give us an opportunity to go back and say, all right, I'm going to go back, I'm going to replay the tape. What could I have done differently? But we can't analyze our performance based on what we did until we have a full understanding of what it is that we want to accomplish in that situation. Because I know for me, with my company, if somebody disrespects my company, then we don't work with them. That's just my rule. But we don't always have that privilege. Ask Kwame 3 years ago, I'm like, man, I need money, okay? I'll take it from anybody, right? So that has to be a consideration too. And so there's no perfect right answer, but those are the types of things we have to consider as we approach the conversation. So I really appreciate you sharing that story. And unfortunately, this isn't the first time I've heard that, especially in the healthcare space too. It's hurtful, but it's real. So we have to start to be ready for those types of situations. Thank you for that. Good. What else? What other situations come up? What other examples? Listen, your example doesn't need to be like as racist, okay? It's not a competition.
I love it.
Hello. Yeah. I have somebody within my department who, she's a white woman, and she consistently mixes up the only 2 black women in our department and introduces them as the incorrect name and fills in details. And she also, like misgenders, and having those conversations, those are tough. I am so sorry.
This is tough. So how many of you have been called the name of somebody else who's the same? Okay, right? This happens. So it is incredibly hurtful because we're individuals, right? And let me tell you a story that helped me to feel a little bit better about the situation. Not to make it feel good, but it helped me to actually understand it, but then also come up with a solution for it. You're going to love the solution, okay? So when Dominic was born, my second son, so I have Kai first, and then Dominic was born. And so Dominic came, and the first time I held him, I said, "Oh, my sweet little Kai Kai." First time I saw this boy, wrong name. So why? Let's think about that. Why? So the way the brain works, there's a concept called neuroplasticity. Long story short, the more you do something, the more you train your brain to do that thing. So you could actually look at somebody's brain and kind of have an idea of what their occupation is. So somebody who's like a violinist has more connections in that part of the brain than somebody who isn't because of the dexterity of their fingers, right? So for 6 years or 5 years, whatever, I was constantly saying, Kai, my son, Kai, my son, Kai. And now I have another one, my son, Kai. Oh, wrong, right? So for years, if they are only interacting with one black person, my black friend, Jamal, right? And so Jamal. Now I have another one. Okay, cool. This is Jamal too. Oh no, right? So here's the solution. It's going to blow your mind. Okay? It's called effort. Okay? It's called effort. That's all it is. So I can empathize with the fact that it's hard. Psychologically, I can understand why it's happening, but I also recognize that you think about a bad habit, you overcome that bad habit by creating new habits, right? So whenever I struggle with somebody's name, then I'm going to make a concerted effort to interact with that person more and say their name more. But a lot of times when we think about the way that we interact with people, when it comes to people who are different from us, we are afraid of these interactions, so we interact less. So we're not getting the reps necessary to be able to distinguish effectively when you're called to do it on the fly, right? So now I'm going to say something a little bit wild, but this is one of the major issues with the way that implicit bias trainings have been done for a very long time. So tell me if you're following just as I go along. Implicit bias is based on science, correct? Good. Implicit bias is real, correct? Good. When we look at the science, based on the research, on the efficacy of implicit bias training, what does that science show us? It doesn't work, right? 2 options. Either it doesn't work, there's no effect, or it makes it worse in most cases. Here's why. So when you go through a typical implicit bias training, they talk about the science of implicit bias, right? Good. Solid. And then they talk about all of the various ways that we can fail in these interactions with people, right? And then a lot of times they say, this is how you can work on your own implicit bias, right? And then they leave. And so then you see somebody who has a different background, and now you're going up to that person, and you're like, oh, okay, so I can fail this way, this way, this way. You know, this is a lot to think about. I'm just not going to have this conversation. So it actually stops us from doing the exact thing that we need to do, which is interacting with people who are demographically different. So if you're doing implicit bias trainings, you have to talk about how we have to interact with people with intentionality, and not just telling them to do it, but showing them how to do it. That's why this book is a skills-based book for human interaction, right? It's not just telling you, hey, this is the right thing to do. It's telling you, hey, if you want to have these conversations, this is how you do it. There are going to be psychological barriers. This is how you circumvent that. And again, for my approach, we have to recognize bias is never going to go away. It's always going to be there. So for me, I just consider it a strategic consideration. What biases might be at play in this situation? So I'm not just focusing on the negative biases that hold us back, because that creates a self-fulfilling prophecy that's problematic. So now I'm not performing at my best because I'm saying this person probably thinks that I'm not smart and I'm aggressive because I'm a black guy, right? So we go in with that mentality, and then that affects the way that I perform, and then I perform at a lower level and I don't get the outcome that I want, and I say, man, see, they were racist, right? So instead, what I do is I say, all right, bias is going to exist, then ethically, I'm going to make sure that the biases work in my favor. If there's going to be bias, I want it to work for me, right? So how do we do that? Very, very simple. So think about when we think about a term called affinity bias, we always think about affinity bias through a negative lens. You are like me, so I like you. That's affinity bias, right? So when we think about culture fit and things like that within organizations, it starts to perpetuate hiring the same people over and over and over again. So that's the negative side about it. But if I'm aware of that psychology, then I can say I'm going to find a way to make affinity bias work for me. So what I'm going to do is, before I get into the substance of the conversation, I'm going to be intentional about finding opportunities to show them that we are similar. What are the similarities? And then I'm going to start to build on that. So for me, it's just a matter of time. So Michael Jordan said, I never lost a game, I just ran out of time. And so for me, when I have a difficult conversation, it's like, I could have persuaded you, it's just a matter of time, right? So, and it sounds wild, but when you think about the section of the book where we talked about Daryl Davis, who was converting KKK members, a black man who converted the grand wizard of the KKK, and now Daryl Davis is the goddaughter of Roger Kelly's daughter. The godfather. He didn't become a goddaughter, right? The godfather of the daughter, right? That's pretty wild. They're literally family at this point. Took him years, though. Took him years. Most of you don't have years to invest, but you can be intentional about taking 5 or 10 minutes to warm up the relationship by focusing on things that we like together, things that we can identify with that are similar. There's always something. And so you find that thing, you point out that point of admiration, they reciprocate with reciprocal admiration, and then we start that positive vibe, and then we go into it. A lot of times we start these conversations at the point of contention. Hey, I think you're evil. Let's talk about that. Right? How are we supposed to be successful? So when you think about this a little bit more strategically, now we can make these difficult conversations easier. We can't guarantee success, but when we take these skills and think a little bit more strategically about it, we can make these difficult conversations easier. That's the goal. Cool. Man, I said I wanted to get to Q&A. Y'all are getting me all hype. All right. So why are these conversations so emotional? What do you think? Do we agree that they are emotional?
Yeah.
Yes. Why? Personal. It's personal, right? That's big. Let's see. Anastasia? Oh, that's good. Yeah, deeply rooted issues that have real world impact, right? Good. I saw a hand over here. Yes. Exactly. Talking about somebody's existence, like who I am as a person, right? Did I see another hand? Yeah. Yes. So we feel uncomfortable, which makes us feel unsafe. So here's one of these things. People ask me, how can I become more comfortable in these difficult conversations? don't know the answer to that, really. You're always going to feel some level of discomfort. And I think a lot of times we feel as though we're entitled to comfort, but if we want to create change, it's not going to be a comfortable process, right? And so we have to start to recognize that our emotions come with signals, and it's up to us to determine what the signal is. So if I feel discomfort, I have to read what that signal is. Okay, I feel uncomfortable, probably shouldn't have the conversation. That's what we think. Not necessarily what the emotion is bringing us. So we can choose to interpret our emotions differently. So I feel uncomfortable. That must mean this conversation is worth having. That must mean there's something at stake, and I probably should say or do something, right? We often misread the message, and that can hold us back. Anybody afraid of public speaking? Come on, people. This is a safe place for people. Here's the fun fact. So I used to be terrified of public speaking. The interesting thing is that I feel the same way every single time. That feeling doesn't change. But there's a concept in psychology called cognitive reappraisal. And so when you think about the way your body responds, you only have a limited way to respond to certain stimuli. So if you're afraid, your hands might sweat, your hands might shake, you might perspire, things like that, right? That's fear. Now, what happens if you're walking down the street and then you see Ryan Reynolds? Yeah. Oh, my God. Right? It's the same thing. But we say, all right, this is love or infatuation, and this is fear. And so for me, when I'm speaking, I say, all right, well, I feel that way. I'm excited. I'm excited to do it. So now I love that feeling when I used to hate it. I just started to think differently about it, right? So we have to recognize that we might not feel comfortable, and a lot of times that's a sign that we're in the right place doing the right thing. Yeah. So I feel like your hand was up and it kept on going down. Yes. Yeah, exactly. So here's two things. So identity, right? It's two main things that we need to worry about. So not worry, but just acknowledge. So it's identity and morality. Identity and morality. So identity, who I am as a person. What does it mean to be me? What does a person like me do in these circumstances? And then morality. What does it mean to be a good or bad person? Okay? So think about how those are at stake in every conversation. So if I'm part of a marginalized community and I'm having a difficult conversation and it seems like somebody seems indifferent to the suffering of people who look like me, now my identity feels a little bit threatened in that situation. Like, you don't care about me as a person. And then when it comes to morality, a lot of times when we have these conversations and we bring up legitimate issues, what ends up happening? The person gets defensive. I'm a good person, right? And then what do? We respond by saying, the thing is, you did this, right? We didn't acknowledge that emotional need. And then they say, no, I'm a good person. No, it wasn't like that. And then we say, this person is focusing more on themselves than they are on the problem that they're perpetuating, right? This is a very predictable psychological response. I am not surprised when that happens. Neither should you. But the thing is, we need to have the skills to break through that. We need to anticipate this type of resistance and then have some way to break through it. And a lot of times what ends up happening is we blame other people for the failures of the conversation instead of thinking about what we could have done differently to elevate the conversation, right? So remember this just in general. It just takes one person to improve the quality of a relationship. Just takes one. And a lot of times we end up saying, oh, they need to do this, they need to do that. And that might be true. It often doesn't change the fact that they are not doing those things. And if we want to have a solution, then we have to be proactive. But we have to have the skills to be able to do that. All right. Cool. We talked about emotions. Great. Here's a simple way to start these conversations. Because you've probably been in a situation like this where something happens that is a little bit, let's say, sketchy, right? A microaggression, something like that. But you seem to be the only person that notices it. A lot of times when it comes to these types of sensitive issues, you're going to recognize that you are the only person who recognizes that a conversation even needs to happen. Everybody else is blissfully unaware, and they just go throughout their day without a care in the world. So starting a conversation that the other person doesn't even recognize needs to happen is really, really challenging to do. So this is a really simple formula that you can use to enter one of those conversations. So step one, you're going to describe the situation using what I call naked facts. So these are facts stripped of all interpretation, judgment, or opinion. So no matter what happened and no matter what side of the situation you're on, you can admit or accept that that is actually what occurred. Okay? Next one would be impact. So we're going to talk about the impact, but from a personalized perspective. So we're not going to talk about the impact in general. We're going to talk about the impact it had on us. Because if it had an impact on you, they can't say, no, you didn't feel that. It's not how brains work, okay? So they can't say that. Next step is invitation. Nobody likes to be ambushed, but we're not giving them the opportunity to not have the conversation. So the options are now or later, okay? So let's say you're in a meeting. Somebody says something that is racially insensitive or insensitive in any capacity, right? As you go through this, you'll recognize that the skills that we're talking about here can be utilized in any conversation. That's by design, right? So you have somebody said something offensive in a meeting. They don't recognize something needs to happen. So what you say is, hey, in yesterday's meeting, you said X, Y, Z. You just quote it as closely as possible, right? Very short. So in yesterday's meeting, you said X, Y, Z. And that made me feel a little bit uncomfortable. And we're going to be working together for the next few months on this project. So I wanted to have a conversation with you to talk about it and see what we can do going forward. That took like 12 seconds. And so a lot of times what ends up happening is we overthink this. So something happens, you're like, man, that was racist. I got to say something. But what do I say? How do I say it? I'm going to Google something real quick. I'm going to, right? And then 3 days pass and you're like, do I look silly if I bring it up at this point? Do they even remember? What should I? Let me Google something else. And then 2 weeks pass and now the conversation has expired, right? And we have to remember that as intellectuals, as thinkers, if you're at a university, I hope you identify as a thinker, right? We have to recognize that sometimes over-intellectualization is just another manifestation of fear. Fear is a very crafty emotion. So I'm going to keep you thinking and keep you thinking that your overthinking is productive. It's not. You got a simple framework that you can use to enter the conversation, and we're going to talk about a simple framework that you can use during the conversation, right? And here's the thing. I could give you a billion like strategic approaches and things like that. Here's the thing. Under duress, you're not going to remember it. What's Kwame's 72-step process for conflict resolution? I remember number 63, okay, right? It doesn't work that way. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you one tool you can use in any difficult conversation, and it's called the Compassionate Curiosity Framework. 3 steps, and there will be a quiz. You laugh, it's funny, it's not a joke. It'll help you to know exactly what to say and when to say it for maximum impact, okay? So, if there is an emotional component, we acknowledge and validate the emotions. After we calm the person down and we recognize that we're kind of at a stable position and we can advance in the conversation, then we get curious with compassion. And then, once we gather enough information, the emotions are at a manageable place, then we go to joint problem solving, which answers the question, what does our relationship look like going forward? How do we solve this problem? What does the future look like going forward, right? This is just problem solving, right? So it helps you to know what to say and when to say it. So let's say we're in a conversation, okay? Just say, put up your fingers 1, 2, or 3. So step 1, step 2, or step 3. It's not rigid, it's flexible. So we're having a conversation, I get emotional. What do you do? Good, thank you. You're so empathetic, I feel better. Now I'm calmer, and we can go into the conversation, but you don't have information. What do you do? Good. All right. But then you asked a question, and it reminded me of something that hurt my feelings in the past. Now I'm emotional again. Okay, good. Great. But that emotion made you curious, and I'm calmer again. What do you do? Great. Now you have enough information, and I am not emotionally triggered. Now what do you do? Now you just gave me a solution that I disagreed with, and now I'm a little bit mad. Okay, you see you see what we do? It's really flexible, really flexible. So I don't want you to have to think so deeply. I want you to be able to flow and know know what to do. So when we're acknowledging and validating the emotions, what we're doing is we're labeling the emotion and giving them the opportunity to vent or share. So it sounds like, it seems like, or I can tell that. Those are your options. That's how I like to empathize with a person. So correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like this situation is having a significant impact on you. Or I can tell that this is something that you really care about. Or it seems like you're really frustrated at the lack of progress. And then you shut up. And then you let them talk. They'll vent for a little bit. Now, this is what people miss at this step. It is very likely, that especially when somebody's very emotional, they will say things that you disagree with at this point. The wrong thing to do is what you will want to do, which is going to be correcting them. And they will feel like you're invalidating their emotions, which will make them more inflamed. So it takes a lot of discipline at this point. Because, listen, you will have your chance to make your point. But if you say the right thing at the wrong time, it doesn't work. So have you ever had a situation where you knew you were objectively correct on the merits, and that got you nothing in the conversation? So what happens if we're in a situation where the facts don't work? What do? You feel like kind of lost, right? Most likely, it's an emotional challenge, and you need to lower the emotional temperature in the room. So you're not just acknowledging and labeling the emotions, you're validating the emotions. So I want you to think about like a grade school math teacher, how they would say, show your work so I can give you partial credit. And so what I'm going to try to do is give them partial credit. I'm going to find places that I agree with, or at least will let them know that I can understand how they got to that point. Right? Okay, so from your perspective, you believe this because of X, Y, Z. Am I understanding that correctly? Okay, yeah, I can see how you think that. That makes sense, right? Now, here's the thing. Empathy does not mean agreement. Acknowledgement, empathizing, validation, it doesn't mean agreement, and it doesn't mean endorsement. It can feel like a concession in the moment. The thing that makes this really tough is that it's not hard to understand what you should do. It's just hard to put it into practice because you're probably emotional too, right? So we have to practice this. It's unnatural, right? It's tough to do, but it pays off. Because a lot of times in these difficult conversations, what you'll find is that the parts that you disagree on are not even fundamental to the issue at hand. They can state their disagreement, but you can stay focused on the actual goal. So, yeah, Constance.
I just whispered to Robert, those are the tools that we all should be using in marriage.
Yep.
Can I get an amen? So I just...
No, you're absolutely right. And here's the thing, like the more emotional you are, the harder it'll be to put this in action. So when I have negotiation experts on the podcast, one of my favorite things is to ask them, okay, this is great. I understand how you resolve conflicts in these really tough situations. How does it work for you at home? They're like, oh my gosh, I'm terrible. Terrible, right? Because the closer the person comes, the more emotional you get. The more emotional you are, the harder it is to hold form. And so when it comes to these difficult conversations, something that I've found is that it's not about saying incredible things, dropping incredible research and data and statistics and things like that. It's usually about just answering this question. Can you maintain form long enough for good things to happen in the conversation? So here's an example. So one of the things that we've heard the value of active listening. Have you heard that? Active listening is good. Great. Okay, cool. So everybody talks about that. Still hard to do. So I'll give you an example. How many folks have kids? Okay, keep your hand up, keep your hand up. How many folks love being criticized about your parenting by your parents? Exactly. It's like, you, funny. You're telling me? Good. All right, so one time, Mom didn't agree with a decision that I made with Kai. And so I just did a presentation, so my skills were sharp. So I was like, okay, I know what I'm going to do here. So I used a tool called the empathy loop. That's the only thing I used. So this is what you do. You listen to what the person says, and then you summarize by saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you're saying blah, blah, blah. And you summarize it. And then you say, is that a fair synopsis? Do I have that right? That's it. 3 steps. Listen, summarize, and then correct my understanding, then ask another open-ended question, keep the conversation flowing. So that's what I did. So Mom was criticizing my parenting. And so I used the empathy loop over and over and over again. And so I did that and listened and didn't say a thing other than the summaries of what she said for 16 straight minutes on the phone. I looked at the phone for the purpose of this story. Because I'm like, if I pull this off, it's going to be incredible. So as I was listening, we got to that 16-minute mark, and I said, okay, great. So what else would you like to share? And she said, Nothing. And I said, okay, well, thank you. Thanks for sharing. And she said, Kwame, are you okay? I was like, yes, I'm fine. I just wanted to make sure that I understood every part of what you were saying. And I said, are you interested in hearing my perspective? She said, yeah, absolutely. So I explained it, took only 60 seconds, and she's like, oh, that was a good call. Yeah, you were right. That's it, right? Now let's think about the story a different type of way. Let's imagine a situation where she made a point, I countered her. Point, counterpoint, point, counterpoint. We'd still be arguing to the day, right? It never would have ended. And so when we're having these conversations, it feels like it's a lifetime. But if I invested 16 minutes in exclusively listening, but if I would have argued, it would have been like 45 minutes to an hour, and she wouldn't have agreed. Because at some point in an argument, you get to a point where the person can't adjust their position while still saving face. So when you think about a difficult conversation or negotiation and the concept of saving face, what that means is allowing the person to exit the conversation with their dignity and self-respect, right? And sometimes I'm not perfect. I'm not perfect, but there have been times where I found myself in an argument, and after 20 minutes, I said, oh my gosh, I'm wrong. I'm wrong, but I can't let them know it. I'm going to keep on fighting because it's about the principle now. It's me versus you. I'm not going to give up, right? And so sometimes we approach these arguments, even if we're right, in a way that's so aggressive that we don't allow the person to adjust, even if they genuinely want to. Right? So think about that same example, but just say, all right, sometimes we listen and we empathize and we do it for 8 minutes, not knowing that we might have been 2 minutes away from a breakthrough. It's just about making sure you can hold your form long enough for good things to happen. All right? Cool. I think that's the last slide. Ask me anything. Yes, there we go. So please ask anything. The harder, the better.
Thank you so much for visiting us and sharing this incredible framework and knowledge, and the book is amazing. My question is simple. Sometimes we find ourselves in an organization where you present us with some amazing individual tactics, but maybe sometimes we're in a group setting, and I know you mentioned that it's sometimes good to off-ramp and not have an audience. But what are some maybe effective strategies to engage in this work in a more pluralistic setting with more people?
Yes, so this requires a little bit more strategy. So what I would do is this, because you're right. What he was referring to was, in the book I talked about the difference between calling out and calling in. So let's go back to that meeting setting. Somebody says something offensive. A lot of times we want to call that person out there. And even if you're right, we create a scenario where it's not a conversation, it's a presentation, where they're not talking to you, they're talking through you to the larger group. And it makes it really difficult for them to save face in that situation. So they feel obligated to defend their morality in that situation. But if we bring them off, they're more likely to be more willing to be vulnerable in that situation because there's not other people watching, right? But there are going to be times where we have to engage an audience in this type of situation. So if you find yourself in an organization that seems to be a little bit resistant, what I would do first before going in front of everybody is I would use an old school negotiation tactic called coalition building. So what I'm going to do, especially if I recognize I don't personally have enough political capital to get this across the finish line, what I'll do is I'll start to build momentum by talking to a sympathetic person who I know I can get on my side, right? And then I'm going to talk to somebody else. Or I might have that person be an ally or an advocate and say, hey, I don't have a great relationship with that person, but I know you do. Can you float this idea to them and start to get them on board? And so we start to warm up the audience before we have that meeting. So it's not the first time that they're presented with this. They can know what's coming. And then you want to set up the meeting in a way that gives you enough time to address this. Now, I like the word control, but I think it needs to have the modifier healthy control of an interaction. So it's not a Machiavellian manipulative type of thing. We're just being intentional about steering the conversation in the right way. So if we want to have a meaningful conversation about DEI and creating change in an organization that isn't changing, then I would want to make sure that I have enough time in that meeting on the agenda to make sure that we flow through this, giving with enough time to go into it, but in an order that makes sense. So for instance, if we just start off with, we need to change everything, we're going to run into a lot of resistance. We could start off building some positive momentum, saying, hey, what's our goal as an organization? Have people contribute. What do we want our culture to be like? Have people contribute. And then say, we've recognized these problems. What can we do about this? And we see how we're warming people up. But the strategy started like weeks or months before. Is that helpful? Yeah. Good question. Good question. Yes.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you so much. I have loved reading your book, and also I just feel like the way that you you said something earlier, simplistic sophistication or so. Yes. Oh. Don't steal it. Just kidding. It's been just very helpful, and I think given at least myself and I'm sure other people a lot more confidence. I'm curious, this is personally for me where I get a little bit of fear and a little bit more sticky when maybe someone who has a significant amount more power than you, are you using the same tactics? My fear would be retaliation, even if it's done with this, empathy loops and everything, you're using all of that there would be negative pushback depending on what your role is in your personal or professional life, and then what the other person's role is.
Yeah, great question. We have to consider the power dynamics. That's legit. And so essentially, it's more or less the same thing when we think about the frameworks that we're going to use, but we frame it slightly differently. So if I'm talking to people who are at my level politically speaking, not political like Democrats, Republican, I'm talking about political capital within an organization, right? Then we can use the tools that I described in the way that I described. But when we're talking about somebody who has more power, we have to make a slight edit. So what we're going to do, we'll introduce the conversation, and we're going to frame it in terms of asking for advice. So this is the problem that I see. How do you think we can address this? Okay, good. Then they'll give their solution. You have to be prepared in this situation, right? They're going to give a solution probably that you've already considered or already tried to implement. And so you say, that's a really great idea. And actually, that's something that I thought about before. And so when I put it into action, this was the result. It didn't really work. So considering the fact that that didn't work, what else do you think we could do? Right? And then ask more questions. So in the book I talked about epistemology. So that's the study of how we know things. And a lot of times if you ask enough questions to a person, they start to reveal their ignorance to themselves. And so what you do is you ask questions. So hypothetically, in that situation, how would you address this? Okay, considering the reality of this, what would you do in that situation? And then they start to lose a little bit of their confidence in their position, because they realize that it's not based on much of anything. And so that gives you a little bit more even playing field, right? So even though they might outrank you in the organization, we have to remember that power comes in different ways. Power comes from knowledge. And if they recognize that you have more knowledge in that interaction, they will kind of lower their status a little bit in order to ask you for some advice, because it would be clear that you've done a little bit more research there too. So it's about adjusting the way that you approach it. You are asking for advice and you're challenging them respectfully just by asking questions, and then they start to recognize that they don't know as much as they thought they did. Yeah, great question, great question. Yeah.
My name is Victoria, and I'm the president of the Black Law Student Association.
Oh, listen. I want to congratulate and commiserate with you at the same time.
So I wanted to, actually recently we had a faculty and BALSA conversation, and that we're on our third iteration of this conversation. It started after the murder of George Floyd, and it's continued to date. And the night before we had this conversation, in my mind I kept going through like, how do we make this conversation the most productive? And we actually used a similar framework in like, I wanted the conversation to be focused a lot on impact, because I think that faculty sometimes it's like the intention versus impact. And so I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on approaches moving forward. While I think the conversation was okay, I think that a lot of our students still left away from the conversation. You go back into our office and they're like, yeah, but they said this one thing, and now it's like literally a loop, or they're in class. And the law, as many of us know, you're consistently, once you get into con law and you start talking about certain things, it automatically triggers students. So I guess my question is more so, if you're trying to make progress with faculty and you want for them to kind of like understand impact, but you also want to have a conversation with students to kind of meet them halfway, what does that strategy look like?
It looks difficult, Yeah, it's funny as you said that because I was Balsa president, and my mentor before I got into law school, he was like, Kwame, don't get into all of these different organizations and don't become Balsa president. I was like, all right, man. And then I did it. I was like, why did I do this? So kudos to you for the work that you're doing. So the key word is accountability. So what we want to do is we want to hold people accountable to the things that they say. So if you think about George Floyd, all of these organizations were saying these incredible things, and then it just kind of disappeared when the emotionality went down. And so we have to recognize that in that meeting, when they're right in front of you, they'll make some commitments. We have to hold them to that. Treat it like a negotiation like you would with a client too, or with opposing counsel. So you have the negotiation, you send that follow-up email outlining the agreement and say, hey, thank you, I'm really excited about this, just to make sure we're on the same page. It sounds like we're agreeing on these types of things. Let me know if I have that wrong, right? So now you create a paper trail. The lawyers that are in the faculty, they should at least respect that, right? And so then you want to get a little bit more concrete with what you want to accomplish and within what timeline. So we have to get more specific because it's really easy for people to say, oh yeah, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. So we also have to remember the reality of the situation. They have not only the power in the situation, they also have time on their side. If they stall you for 3 years, you graduate, you're gone, right? So you have to make sure that it's on a timeline that's realistic. And then you also have to make sure that there is, especially when you're trying to create change within an organization, you as Balsa president, hypothetically, maybe there are some people who are less diplomatic than you who are in Balsa who might circumvent your communication and might inadvertently make things worse. So one of the things that you have to do is you have to make sure that you're having those internal negotiations within your ranks so everybody's aligned with the strategy that you put into practice. Because if somebody goes out of rank, then what's going to end up happening is that you're going to get judged by the most extreme characters on your team. And that makes you less persuasive. So before you start engaging with the faculty and those type of things, you need to make sure that the people that you're serving and you're representing are in alignment with the approach so everybody knows what part of the strategy they need to put in place. And then you can go in with a united front, which gives you more persuasive power too. Yeah, great question, great question. Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
So I have a question about code switching, which is something that you address, and it really resonated with me. I'm an immigrant from India, and I moved here 18 years ago, so I feel like I'm code switching every day, all the time. When I go to India, I talk like this, and then when I'm here, I talk differently. And at one point, somewhat recently actually, my mother-in-law, she heard me speaking to my family in India, and she was like, which version of you is accurate? Like, which one is fake? And I was like, they're all me. It's just who I am. And she made a point. She was like, your 2.5-year-old is going to be very confused about how to behave, and he's going to pick up this confusion. And I didn't know how to respond to that because I think of code switching as a good thing.
Yes. So there were many times when I was writing this book, I was like, this is the one that's going to get me canceled. Code switching was one of those points. And I think it's not, we create this false dichotomy where it's like either code switching is good or code switching is bad. Okay, so for people who say code switching is bad, do you talk to your parents the same way you talk to your friends? No, nobody does that because we recognize that we have to do a little code switching, and it's automatic. I'm assuming with you, it's not always a choice. It just kind of happens. You're not, yeah, it just happens. And so here's the thing. It's a legitimate concern if you don't understand the psychology behind it. Because that's not, with code switching, that's a part of cultural intelligence that you adopt simply by putting yourself in a position where you're exposing yourself to new cultures. I can't code switch to an Indian culture because I'm not familiar with the Indian culture, nor have I been in it. So that is the difference between authentic code switching and mockery, right? So you have to be part of that, or that culture, right? So when it comes to your 2.5-year-old, they might not be able to articulate how and why they code switch. They'll just be able to do it. Right? So as long as you keep on exposing them to different circumstances and different people, they'll understand which part of themselves they need to put out at what time. And code switching, whatever you do, it has to be authentic. If you feel like, this feels icky, then that's not code switching, that's a concession, right? And you don't want to do that. So as long as it's natural and it's just happening naturally, then go ahead and do it. And just with your 2.5-year-old, I wouldn't be worried about their ability to flow and understand what to do at what time. Just keep introducing them to new cultures and new scenarios, and they'll pick it up just fluidly? Yeah, great question. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all the humor in your talking to us. It really helps. In one-on-one conversations, if the other party is unwilling to also acknowledge and value and respect your emotions, I think there's a tendency toward that in our current political climate. These words like snowflake, like triggered, and speaking as a person who has a tendency to get emotional during difficult conversations, that unwillingness to enter the empathy loop, if you will, can create this real fear of a lack of psychological safety that can make you want to avoid those difficult conversations. Do you have any advice for that kind of difficult conversation?
Yes. So it's a tough situation, and a lot of us can identify with that situation too, where we're going into the conversation trying wholeheartedly to have a mutual exchange of information, but the other person doesn't seem very interested in that, right? That does happen. So a couple of things. So first of all, in those tough conversations, what I changed my mentality to think in terms of I deserve a certain level of treatment. I've changed it to say I trust my skills enough to be able to withstand anything in that situation. So I don't have faith in their ability to perform at a high level. I have faith in my ability to perform at a high level. So you can always have faith in yourself. And so when we think about these difficult conversations that we have day to day, we often are afraid of failure, but I think we have to change our perspective of what failure is. And so you can win all of these conversations if you're doing two things. Number one, you're putting yourself in the best position for success. You're doing the best you can. Number two, after every single conversation, we're replaying the tape and saying, what could I have done differently to make the situation better? If we look back on the conversation and we recognize, it's interesting, I was trying to be empathetic, but this person was not trying to be empathetic. What went wrong? One of the things I would do is I would ask them to explain how I feel. And then they will struggle to do so, right? And then I would say, hey, are you interested in kind of getting a better understanding? So a lot of times when I feel like somebody's not listening to me or not empathizing with me, I'll ask them a question that requires them to empathize in order to answer the question, right? Because again, empathy isn't about agreeing. It's not about feeling what the other person feels. That's more like sympathy. But with empathizing, it's just understanding how they see, think, and feel about the situation. So I would ask them, hey, we've been having this conversation for a while, and it doesn't seem like I'm having trouble to making my point. What do you think my point is? How would you explain my position, right? And then they will fail because they weren't listening. It's like, okay, see, that's you were close but not right. Are you interested in hearing my perspective? And so that usually gives them a little bit of the humility that they need in order to move forward in the conversation, right? Because they thought they knew it all. Then they just prove to you and to themselves that they don't know it all. That triggers a little bit more listening. That's one thing. Another thing that we can do is I call it commentating the conversation. So think about a sporting event. We have the commentators who are looking down on the field talking about what the athletes are doing. So what I would do is I did this yesterday. I would have the person come and sit in the commentator's booth with me. So I'd say this, all right, let's take a step back real quick. So I literally said this. You do not need to be articulate to say this. I said, I'm not sure what's happening here. I don't know what's happening. We're having this conversation, and I don't know what's happening, but I know it's not good. What do you think's happening? Yeah, this is not going well. Okay, what do you think is the roots of why this isn't going well? Well, I'm trying to do this. And what are you trying to accomplish? Oh, I'm trying to do this. So we take a step back together and analyze the conversation and say, okay, it seems like we messed up at that point. How about we jump back in there, right? And I think that humility and vulnerability opens people up because it shows them that they're willing to be, they can be safe in the interaction too. Because a lot of times we think about people who are bullies or they're not empathizing and those type of things. Sometimes it just comes from fear, right? We have fight or flight response. They just might be a fighter. That might be their response. And they're not willing to open up and be vulnerable, right? And so in those situations, that type of approach, those two approaches can help. Now there's number 3. This is a bit more assertive, not aggressive, a bit more assertive. So for me, I value my time and I don't want to waste my time. And so for me, I want to make sure that I'm always being treated with a certain amount of respect in a conversation. And if I don't think I'm getting that, depending on the circumstance, then they might lose the privilege to talk to me, right? So if it's a situation where there's something that I need to accomplish, then I'm going to swallow that and I'm going to keep on pushing forward. But a lot of these conversations, there's nothing in particular at stake. And what I'll say is like, listen, I'm trying to have this conversation and I'm trying to explain things and it doesn't seem like you're listening. And in the conversation, you referred to me and people like me like Snowflake. That didn't feel very respectful. So it doesn't feel like this conversation is going anywhere, so I'll respectfully decline. And a lot of times people would say, nobody wants to look like the villain because you just objectively listed things that they did that were wrong. And what ends up happening is it changes the dynamic in the situation. It gives you more leverage because essentially you helped them to see, hey, I'm going to shine the mirror back on you. This is what you said. This is how it made me feel. So I'm going to back out of the conversation. And now you become their only route to redemption. So they say, no, please, no, I'm sorry. I'm going to go. Right. Now you want to talk. Well, great. Now we can talk more on my terms once you've humbled yourself. So those are 3 different approaches that you could use in those types of situations. Yeah. Great question. Yeah.
I'm just going to start by acknowledging a couple of things that you're doing amazing here. And then I'm going to ask you, help me understand the framework that I've been functioning within and what you're presenting merge to help me to clarify a couple of things in my mind. So I'm a conflict resolution practitioner myself. I've been trained in this area. I've been teaching similar concepts to Case Western students over the years within the political science department. And I always start from self. I'm teaching international conflict resolution, and I'm telling students that if you can't practice at home, you won't be able to help 2 countries negotiate a deal. So I want to acknowledge that this is amazing, that you are really bringing this, I say because this is my field, this is a field. This is a field of study. This has a lot of research, and you are making it so accessible and bringing it as a framework to the conversation about race. So I just want to acknowledge that as a fellow practitioner or teacher of conflict resolution. So let me put it out there. This is amazing. So I have been functioning in my personal life within the framework of nonviolent communication that was developed by Marshall Rosenberg. And it is very, very similar, right? One thing that is very particular within Marshall's framework is the concept of need, right? So empathy is not just about feelings, but there are needs involved, right? I mean, I can figure out a way to deal with my own feelings. You know, I can stomp my feet, I can do crazy things, deal with it, go to my balcony, right? The metaphor that we use, and like deal with it over there, or acknowledge or reflect back the feelings of the other so that I help them figure that out and then ask an open-ended question to see if I'm following, if I'm understanding. But with the concept of race and the race conversations within this context, this is not my country. I came to this country from Turkey, right? And I am dealing with that in a different way, right? Not maybe within the framework that we're talking about, but what Kritika, our friend, mentioned here, coming from India, I'm doing that code switching constantly as well. So long story short, I want to understand how can we make sure and convince people, because that's what I'm trying to do. I'm telling my students, you keep practicing this. It's going to open up a lot of things for you. Daryl Davis has always been an example for me as well. If he can do it, you can do it as well. So how can we talk about needs within that framework? Because there's so many unfulfilled needs within the conversation of race. There's security. There's life, right? There's so many stuff. So how does need concept fits into your model, your presentation? And also the continuation of asking for that need. How do you send that request to the most powerful, right?
Yes.
So if you can elaborate, help me understand, I would appreciate it.
I appreciate it. No, thank you. And thanks for the compliments too. A big part of what I want to do with all of this is take the conflict resolution fundamentals that have been in existence for decades and just make it in a more palatable, accessible way with the podcast and with the book. So I appreciate that. And when it comes to the needs, I think about it in 2 main ways, just really broadly speaking. We have the emotional needs and we have the substantive needs. And both parties in the conversation will have different types of needs. And I think one of the things that would be helpful in these conversations is acknowledging the validity of the needs of everybody involved. Because we have to think about it, right? Let's just state some facts. There have been voices that have been amplified for centuries to the detriment of others, right? And so a lot of times we bring all of that history into these conversations and we say, this is my time, it's your time to listen to me, right? We feel that. Now here's the challenge. That feeling is rooted in reality and the history of society. It does not change the psychology that is happening in these conversations. So if I go into any conversation, strip race from it, just any conversation, and I make it all about me, what I need, and my people, the other person's going to say, well, what about me? I don't want to make it about me, but my psychology makes it difficult for me to not consider myself. So I think what we have to do is we have to recognize the reciprocal nature of need. I have needs, those are valid. You have needs, those are valid. And I think by starting off at the beginning of the conversation and acknowledging the mutuality of needs, that helps people to feel more comfortable leaning in. Because otherwise, we have to think about, especially people who are in power, if it's a conversation that is unpleasant and it doesn't feel like their needs or personhood is being respected, they have the privilege to say, I don't need this conversation at all. So I'm just not going to have it. You were bringing up some good points, but that felt bad. I'm busy enough. I got a family, I've got a company, or whatever it happens to be. And so they have the privilege of being able to not have the conversation. So I think it's really hard to kind of address the conversation when you are bringing so much to the conversation, so much history and everything like that. But then when we look at it from a strategic lens as a conflict resolution practitioners, and then from a psychological lens, we have to sometimes make some emotional sacrifices in the moment to be effective at the negotiation table. Yeah, thank you. Great question. Great question. How much time do we have?
We have one more.
Okay, all right. See, time is a social construct. If you never told me the time, I'd never stop. Cool. Yes.
Right, now I feel the pressure to have a good question. So we started off talking about implicit bias training, which I totally agree is not a functional system, but is appealing because it reaches large groups of people and because it addresses the people who have the biases. And I love the solutions you presented, but it feels like they put a lot of burden on the minoritized individual to do the work and are very individualized. So do you think there's ways that this can transform into systemic change and address those larger groups and larger issues?
Yeah, 100%. And so I want to make it clear, I'm not saying that we abandon bias training. We just need to do it better. Like it has to be recognizing the science, but also giving people the skills to overcome those barriers too, right? And so I think it's necessary, because a lot of people are just flying blind, not knowing the biases that they have. So we need to make sure that we're doing it. We just need to do it the right way. And I think then we have to move to a more strategic lens and start to think about what it is that we actually want to accomplish day to day. So for me, I'm thinking about this as a lawyer and somebody who studied public policy. So I'm recognizing, great, we can have these conversations, we can empathize, and this is good interpersonally. But when we think about the larger context, we need to be a little bit more strategic about the what we want to accomplish. So it's about return on investment. We don't have endless amounts of political capital to create positive change. If we did, we would have done it, right? We have to recognize that we have to pick our battles from time to time. So is this the hill that I want to die on? Yeah, it's important, but I recognize here also there's a bigger systemic issue that we really need to address, right? So let's hit on a touchy subject. So think about like George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, and other Black Americans who were murdered by the police, right? So a lot of times we find ourselves having these conversations about the details of the facts, like we're trying to litigate the case, right? What does that get us? It just gets us pissed, right? And so it causes more division. But what we can do is say, this is an unfortunate situation, and it gives us an opportunity to talk about the prison industrial complex. It gives us an opportunity to talk about civil rights issue, criminal justice issues, and other systemic issues in our community, right? So yes, the details of the case matter. They're going to be litigated by attorneys and judges and things like that. But it gives us as individuals who are not directly tied to that case an opportunity to have a larger conversation about the macro level issues and what we can do to move things forward. So I think we have to be a little bit more strategic when it comes to how we engage in these difficult conversations, and recognizing not only do we don't have unlimited political capital to create positive change, we have limited energy. How many of you get tired having these conversations and it feels like we're not accomplishing anything? So we have to be really, 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 really targeted. So it requires a thin slice. So for me, my contribution is this. Negotiation skills, this is it. So I made it really clear at the beginning. I'm not going to teach you how to think about race. I'm going to teach you how to talk about race. I'm just focusing on the skills. Other people can talk about the other macro level issues. Those are really important. But my unique contribution is this. And so each of us have to think about what we have to offer. What's our unique contribution? We all have privilege in our own ways. We have to figure out what that way is and maximize that to move things forward. So that's the way I would approach it. Cool. Awesome. Thank you.
Here, here. Kwame, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your thoughtfulness, and I know that we'll be forever changed. We do have books in the back, and for those who have not gotten them, Kwame has said that he will donate the book to anyone who wants to get it, the ones that he has back there. So don't fight with one another to get over there, but we're thankful. And he's going to be signing the books back there. I did want to make sure that we told you about a couple of announcements and then we'll dismiss out. One is that we want you to know about Envision Weekend. Envision Weekend, which is taking place on August 18th through 20th. This is a collaborative effort. We're partnering with Student Affairs, Admissions and Enrollment, Student Advancement, the Office of Multicultural Affairs, along with OIDIO to do an early arrival program for our historically underrepresented minority students. We need student leaders. We need volunteers. Tiara, raise your hand back there. That is Tiara Sargent. She's our diversity program manager. This is her work. She put everything together, so let's give her a round of applause. As well as our incredible OIDIO team. We have Michael Bustamante there. We have Janae Johnson, Dr. Heather Burton. I call them the dream team, so we're so happy to have them here. But if you would like to support Envision Weekend, please see Tiara so you can get some of the details. We will also be sending some announcements about our annual Juneteenth celebration that'll be coming up. So we get a lot of exciting things planned as we move into the summer. And we just thank you all for coming and supporting the work that we do here at Case Western Reserve University to advance inclusive excellence. Thank you again.